听见资本本期视频为您带来的是摩根大通在3月28日录制的周末会议，关于贸易关税升级可能推动美国经济陷入衰退风险的话题。这场会议直指美国经济的命门，关税政策可能把我们推向衰退边缘。他们说，关税税率可能飙到 11%， 这意味着什么？商店里的东西更贵，消费者捂紧钱包，企业对未来没信心，这可不是小打小闹。他们预测下季度核心 CPI 会冲到 4%， GDP 增长却只有 1.25%， 经济几乎停摆。更糟的是，墨西哥已经陷入衰退，加拿大也快撑不住了。布鲁斯觉得美国经济还有韧性，能扛一扛。但Joe不乐观，他看到企业情绪下滑，市场还没反应过来风险，他们给衰退概率定了 40%， 而Joe私下觉得这数字低了，这跟最近的新闻脱不开干系。特朗普的关税计划正在升级，从 3% 涨到 9%， 比2018年贸易战猛4倍。那次贸易战就让全球制造业凉了一半，现在这波冲击能有多大？美联储还在纠结利率，市场却像没睡醒，股票回调不明显，信用利差也没动静。可一旦企业缩减招聘和支出，麻烦就大了。这不只是华尔街的数字游戏，你的钱包、工作、投资都会受影响。下周的数据、就业、PMI 还有政府公告可能是关键转折点。如果关税战扩展到欧盟和北美，两位专家都觉得 40% 的衰退概率就兜不住了。这事关乎每个人，关税挤压购买力，企业信心崩盘，可能是衰退的导火索。两位专家警告，别指望大规模减税救场，美联储也未必能大放水。经济像在走钢丝，一步踩空就是深渊。他们怎么剖析这些风险？看看我们离悬崖到底还有多远。接下来是英文会议的全部内容。如果您需要我的投研助理人工校对的中文文本，您可以在频道的 Patreon 上获取。
Welcome to the JP Morgan Weekender. I'm Bruce Kasman. With me this weekender is Joe Lupton, who's on his way back from Asia and Australia and is sitting in a lounge in Los Angeles. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Bruce. Just waking up here.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I had pretty bad jet lag coming back, so I hope you handle it better than I do. So,
age has something to do with that.
It's unfortunate how many things age has something to do with. But let's assume that age also provides some wisdom. So let's at least assume that for at least the first 5 minutes of this call.
That'll be debatable. That will unfold as we discuss.
No, I know you're going to want to argue about that, but let's give me 5 minutes before you jump in on this. Okay, so last week we reset our tariff view. Now are expecting U.S. effective tariff rate to go up to about 11%, and we're starting to make adjustments to our forecast. I think what's important this week is the changes in North America. And some of that, of course, is that we have been shifting towards a view that we're going to get some fairly significant sectoral tariffs, and autos being one. Did get that announced on Wednesday. On the heels of that and some weak data, we now have Mexico in recession. The Canada teams now, I don't think they're quite in recession, but they have a contraction next quarter. And I think the U.S., we have been downplaying the first quarter downshift, which is now basically a stall in our forecast. But with bigger tariff increases, we now have core CPI gains tracking mid-4s next quarter. And that in our forecast is going to ding consumer spending, and it's going to keep us from recovering off this first quarter low. And we now have a forecast for U.S. GDP to grow 1.25%. So I guess, Joe, where we stand now, and we can kind of, go back and forth on this, is we've had a 40% recession probability. And, part of the issue here is how much more concerned we should be. I mean, from my point of view, the data is not the primary issue here. At the same time that we took the U.S. down, we've gotten constructive reports on profits, household income. It still seems to me to suggest the U.S. has got balanced income generation. It's a rebound taking hold in business spending. I think we're going to get a decent job number next week. So I'm kind of still in the mind that we have the tension between a resilient U.S. and global economy that can absorb shocks, and we have the risk here that the shock, while it is getting larger, could prove large enough to actually tip us into recession. So the question is, where I want to get your read on where you are, having been in Asia, and then also maybe focus on what next week, as we start to get some important announcements, also announcements from the administration, get payrolls, we get PMIs, what would kind of push us more in the positive or negative direction around that. But let me just stop. Let me take your temperature now in terms of how you're reading the world, the risks around the life of the expansion.
Yeah, I mean, very similarly in the sense that, I've kind of had this notion of worlds colliding, the kind of this healthy expansion that you've been talking about, you laid out. It's always tempting as a forecaster to kind of say momentum is your friend, but, the other point I keep making is that momentum is actually your enemy when you're getting hit by a shock. So all this backward-looking stuff that makes us feel better about labor markets and claims holding up, to me, I just throw out the window. Like, I don't care about that. It gives me a little bit more resilience to weather the shock, but I'm kind of fully focused on the shock. I'm looking at the things you have been making a big deal about sentiment, this week's flash PMIs, case in point, where you figure the output indexes actually give you a decent read on growth. Things aren't so bad. It doesn't feel like things are breaking, but that component that, we have put a lot of weight on and indeed was actually the right signal maker in the 2018-19 trade war was the future output PMI. That thing is coming down. And so that worries me. That's my that's as we're going into the forward-looking part of this. And then we got all these, kind of new shocks, new kind of tariff announcements this week. And, if people were out there hoping that, Trump was not going to deliver on all these tariffs, that this was underperforming or work or negotiating type reasons, I think every day they're sadly mistaken. And this is ratcheting up. And while you were kind of pointing out the purchasing power squeeze that's going to come from tariffs, that to me is like the starter and the catalyst for things, but it's more the second round type effects. As Bostic said this week, and Krugler and Musalam all talked about the second round effects, not only on inflation, but on growth. And I'm more worried about what a business is going to do on the kind of hiring and this broader spending side of things. And it's very prospective. You and I were talking at the start of this, we don't know. Everything's forecast at this point. There's nothing in terms of data tracking that's helping. It's kind of sentiment type stuff that we're looking for. And so it leaves us just with a call, and you kind of bottom line it in terms of your question. Yeah, I've been more nervous than I think the average consensus out there. And I'm probably getting a little bit more nervous. And I can tell you most of the people I spoke to in Asia, I'd asked them where they were, and the response was always, well, I'm a little bit more nervous after this meeting than I was before this meeting. So I think people are kind of moving into the more kind of worrying camp here.
You're an ambassador of joy coming through the region. So let's be concrete here in terms of, next week will be an important week. I'll throw out a couple of markers here. Let me see what you kind of want to emphasize. I think if we're going to hold the line at a 40% probability, not go more concerned, I think first and foremost, we have to basically be comfortable that our new baseline view is maintained, which is that the retaliatory actions are narrow. They don't go into VAT and other non-tariff areas in a significant way, that they are a pressure point for extracting concessions, and perhaps most importantly, that they don't go into taking broader actions on the EU or North America. I think an opening up of a broad trade tariff war with those two regions would definitely raise concerns beyond where we are right now. I think
Bruce,
along the lines
just on that point then, let me just kind of push on that, because first of all, I feel like what we've already done in the announcement this week now gets us up to, I guess, like an average tariff rate of close to 9%, right?
Yeah.
So we're going from like 3 to 9. That's a 6 percentage point move versus the 2018-19, which was like a 1.5 percentage point. So we're already 4 times bigger than the 2018-19 trade war, which brought global manufacturing from 5%.
Right, but I think when you say that, and you say that often, I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is a roughly 8 to 10 percentage point rise in U.S. tariffs. If you run it through economic models, IMF, others, the direct effect that something around 0.5% off GDP growth, and it's usually viewed as being felt over 18 months or so. But the big issue is the sentiment channels. It is the
you never had
so
spot that, Bruce.
But that's not the but it's not. Let me finish. It's not the magnitude of how this shock compares to the shock in 2018-19. It's whether or not this shock, and the way I would characterize it, is whether this shock combined with other things we're seeing tilts the perception of U.S. businesses, perhaps even global businesses, to thinking that this is an administration that really is not tempering actions to support the business sector going forward. If that happens,
they clearly are. They clearly are. And I never took sentiment out of this effect. I think sentiment is absolutely a huge part of the shock here. I think the macro models are based on a linearized model. I don't want to get wonky here, but anyone who knows how these models are put together, they're linearized. These are nonlinear effects. Linear models work when you're doing small shocks. The bigger the shock, the more nonlinear the effect is. So I just don't like looking at, IMF's only a few tenths off from this. That's bogus. I think it's going to be bigger. Even the direct effect is going to be bigger. But yes, 100%. The sentiment shock is going to be much bigger. And that's coming off. And you're 100% right that people are looking at this administration as not being business friendly. This is not a business friendly administration. This administration that has advisors around him that want to bring back some type of mercantilist 19th century America with a goal of trying to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. We can debate whether that's either sensible or whether we would actually even get there. But nonetheless, that's the goal, and a willingness to generate a recession to get those goals. That's the new.
So let's just sort of say you're talking in terms of a shock that's multiples of 2018-19. The 2018-19 shock took our MEI, which started in early 2018, running about 0.5 point from a standard deviation perspective above our cycle average to something around 1.5 points below. Where would you anticipate? Right now, we're sitting just a touch below that average. Where would you expect things to be in 3 months on that?
Well, I think our MRIs are kind of based on diffusion indexes. MEIs are kind of diffusion indexes. So like our PMIs never capture the full extent of downturn. So,
but how do you capture a shock?
Twice, I would say twice as big as
okay,
20.
So that's a good scaling. That would be a three-point move in that series. And so far we're standing above where we were 3 or 4 months ago. We're not at a particularly high level. So, you could decide how you think about levels or changes in that context. I would think a 2-point move would be a big enough move to really kind of push us beyond what our risks are. And I think about it partly in the context of what else is happening on policy, where we're going to be in terms of squeezing consumers.
Let me put the question back to you, Bruce. Just maybe this will be helpful to nail it down. What would get you, and everyone knows who watches this, neither you or I control any forecast, but if you were writing a forecast down, what would get you to say, you know what, I'm going to forecast a recession?
Well, I think it is just beyond the idea that the data breaks, which I think we're obviously not there. Yeah, no, I know. Sometimes you forecast a recession when it's starting, but I would argue
it's a great job we have.
Right. Well, oftentimes we forecast a recession 3 to 6 months after it's started, and we've lived through that, unfortunately. I would argue that if we got a shock which was at the same size and even a little larger, just a little larger than what we had in 2018-19, I would probably be over the hump on that. So something like a 2-point or more move down in the MEI, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
Something greater than that against the backdrop of signals coming.
But Bruce, I think that's data tracking, and that's all fine. That's useful information. But I just want to know, what on the policy front? We come in next week.
I think if we go to I don't think this is going to happen, but obviously there's a risk. If we went and we put tariffs on everything we buy from Mexico and Canada of something like 25%, there were rumors. I don't think it's going to happen, but if we talk about 20% across the board tariffs on the EU, those are the things that I think takes me over the hump. If we're doing a set of small retaliatory tariffs on countries that are, viewed as having unfair trade practices, if we hit pharmaceuticals and possibly semiconductors, and that's it, and we don't kind of go down the road of this escalating much further, then I think that's within the context of our baseline. That's the way I would look at it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I feel like after this week, particularly after we're in addition seeing that you're not going to get much in the form of, any big tax cuts, any of these other policies that were supposed to be offsets. We
weren't looking for tax cuts as offsets, Joe. No, that wasn't on our baseline.
But I just think there's going to be a disappointment that was not fully baked into our forecast, right? Obviously, I've been a bit more negative on things anyway.
Well, I don't think we're over the edge yet. I think we're close to the edge. And, we'll see.
And by the way, for what it's worth, it sounded like the EU trade rep, I can't say his name, but
right. He's the one who raised the prospect.
20%, right?
Right. That's my point. He's the one who raised that prospect. I would agree. If we go with a 20% tariff on everything we buy from the EU, if we go forward on broad tariffs on the North American economy, that to me is steps that are well beyond what I would say is embedded in a 40% probability, which is already high for reasons that have to do with other things that could combine in more negative ways. But so that's sort of one point. What do we get next week? Obviously, next week's not the end of that story. I think the data does matter, even though it's not the end of the story, regardless of which way it turns. I do think we've got a forecast.
Can you just say which data?
I'm going to.
No, I know. But I just want to make this general point and then let you make the point about the U.S. data. I agree, employment is one. But like all the PMIs and everything, it's so backward looking at this point. This is where it's just like, momentum's not your friend here. Like, don't look at what's happening through 4Q and into 1Q. We're getting walloped with a sledgehammer here. And it's just like, is there going to be enough resilience to tolerate that or not?
I don't think I don't think the data is unimportant here, Joe. I think we're starting to get signals as we move through March and April of how these things are affecting sentiment. Like one thing that's what we're going to get next week. We're going to get March payrolls. We're going to get March PMIs. We're going to get, some things that are going to be at that front end of the data flow. And I think in the U.S. payroll report, I think having continued solid private sector job growth, 135 is our forecast. I think it's important that if you look at the move into the start of the year, job growth was solid and business spending is picking up, but the work week took a step down. Hours have been weak. I do think you need to see some rebound in hours, which will give me some comfort about where we stand. I would say on the PMIs right now, what I'd be focused on for March is to get confirmation, which we already have from the DM, which is most of the sample, that the services PMIs held up. They held up in activity, as you well pointed out. They took a step down in sentiment, and both of those things do matter. But just to get confirmation that the services PMI is up and that we're tracking in the GDP space is still pretty solid underlying GDP gain. I think in the manufacturing side, there's a really kind of funky debate here in the data, which is we've been having with our Asian colleagues to some degree. We've got a big surge in U.S. imports. We've got a pretty broad-based surge in Asian exports.
That's very backward looking.
Well, I think it is a reflection of the fact that the front loading has taken place. I think the question there, and maybe it's not the important question because it's a short-term one, is to what degree is February mark the end of this and we're starting to roll? The March PMIs in the DM took a step down and obviously raised some concern that might be the case. I don't think we're quite done with it. We'll look at the March surveys more broadly globally to get a read on that. And I do think we should understand that in the context of that, again, it is backward looking. Some of the stuff holding back U.S. growth in Q1 is boosting growth elsewhere. That's kind of where we are. And I think we're going to be tracking both the policy side, the sentiment side, and the actual data side. Yeah.
In your kind of recollection, your kind of deep historical knowledge of the cycles.
I want to go back to the early 20th century here. Let's go.
Yeah, we'll get Jan on the call.
Jan goes 19th century.
Okay. Like, is there a recession that you'd say that you could like equate to, if we go into a recession, something that was either like a shock like this, or just like a sentiment-induced shock that drove us into recession? Like I have in mind, I kind of want to say like, you generally would see your strong data up until when it breaks. That's why I'm just like, I don't really care about the backward looking data. There's going to be a shoe that drops here. And I'm just trying to think of like other recessions. Like, is it the case that payrolls generally are doing well right up until the edge of things breaking down?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different. So let's come back to principles here. Recessions are about the interaction between shocks, kind of vulnerabilities, kind of building in an expansion, and then monetary policy and financial conditions. And sometimes these things kind of hit without vulnerabilities, shocks in the financial conditions, and can take you down from a position where basically businesses are still moving forward. Sometimes what goes on is you start to build sectoral shocks or tightening in financial conditions, and businesses resist it. They still maintain a level of optimism. So they're continuing to expand, but the underlying margins, the kinds of things that go on in credit access and stuff are starting to tighten. And it's not an immediate process, but you could see the kind of the building of those vulnerabilities. And then sometimes you get hit with a shock, the pandemic probably being the most powerful of these, where you get hit with a shock that just hits you so hard.
Well, that's the clearest one. I mean, I don't think anyone is saying that that's the type of shock we're experiencing, but
it could be, Joe. It could be. I mean, this is, I think, the interesting thing. No, not to the magnitude of that, but there's two ways to think about how to kind of go from where we are. We both agree that this is still a fundamentally solid underpinnings of an expansion. And I think one way that things break, which is kind of what we've been talking about, is that the policy shifts are so aggressive and so disruptive between February and, let's say, May, June, that by the time we're sitting here in the early summer, it's hit sentiment so hard, it's hit things so hard that, oftentimes these vulnerabilities that we're seeing build over the course of, 4, 8, 12 quarters, that I don't think if they build over the course of, 3 to 4 months, that this would be viewed as a normal dynamic on that. It would be viewed much more like a shock hit us.
One of the things that we've been saying, and I still believe, is that the reason we haven't had a recession for the last 2 years is that despite high rates, we just haven't had much of a cyclical buildup of vulnerabilities. And I still feel like all of the fundamentals are kind of mid-cycle. And so the question I sometimes get, and I was getting in Asia, was like, what's the dynamic of this type of recession if we were to go into recession? Is it just a pure sentiment shock? And can you give me an example of a period when that happened? And I felt like the early 90s was sometimes viewed as a sentiment shock, although you did have the savings and loan crisis.
I don't think the early 90s is an appropriate picture of that, because I think you were
where sentiment was driving a lot of the weakness in the consumer in a way that was different than the fundamentals.
Well, I think what you had in the late 80s is you had a situation where the domestic economy was starting to come under pressure. You were seeing margins compress. You were seeing consumers turn more sluggish. You were seeing the Fed tight in 87 to 89. And then
rehash all that. Like, what is it?
Let me make the point that then that story was being offset for a while by the strength of demand coming out of Europe and Japan. Yeah. And then what happened is that vulnerability that was building on the domestic side got kind of interacted with another leg of the savings and loan problems and an energy price shock that happened when we invaded, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. So I think the point is that most recessions have some mix of vulnerabilities, Fed and financial conditions tightening, and shocks, whether you want to call it a sentiment shock or a pandemic shock, which is a pure, supply shock. I think the right point to make here is it's hard to identify a pure supply sentiment shock. The supply shock of the pandemic is one. I think that most of the other shocks which have energy prices associated with them also had, generally speaking, the vulnerabilities building. I'm not sure 73, 74 was that, but you had a lot of Fed tightening going on at that time. So I have I'm a hard time putting this into that lens. But here's the point I want to make, which is coming back to what you were saying before. There's a couple of different ways this can play out. One is that the policy and sentiment shock could be so overwhelming in the next 3 or 4 months that it doesn't matter how fundamentally sound we are. It just overwhelms it, and we break. And one of the points there is, but
the point then is that this would probably be the first time we've ever seen that type of recession.
Well, I think in the pandemic we had a supply shock that did that.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to say the pandemic is the same as Trump, then sure.
And you could argue that there's a connection between Nixon putting tariffs on and doing price controls in the early 70s, which had some funky connection to the recession dynamic at that point. But anyway, leave that aside. But I want to emphasize that there's another way this could play out, which is recognizing the underlying health of the expansion, that these shocks could gradually hurt things over a period of 6 or 12 months. And rather than have a recession this summer, it could take a longer period of time. I don't think it's easy to identify one specific dynamic which this actually works on. There are, I think, a couple of different ways this can play out, including not having a recession at all, which again, that is still our baseline. So let's not.
Corollary to this is that if we did have a recession, it's not clear that it would be a bad recession.
Well, this is complicated because I think once you go into recession, you find problems that you didn't think existed. I think if you go into a recession in the current environment, it's hard to get yourself comfortable that there'll be a lot of fiscal easing. The Fed may be more limited than normal. So,
yep, that's the offset to that point. That's 100% right.
It's not a deleveraging GFC type story, but could it be like the early 2000s, which were a mild recession in GDP, but there was 2 or 3 years where you took a while to get out of it, and you had some pretty serious financial reverberations. I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to.
But again, I think what we're going to come to conclude here is that every recession is a little bit different. But I would have said the 2000s also had the corporate sector that was really in a bad shape with imbalances that was working out. And you also had the beginning of the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector.
To be more nuanced in a Tolstoyan way, every recession is
biblical. Stay away from that.
Every recession is similar in that as it happens, you break the labor market and you create nonlinear dynamics that play out over at least six or 9 months. But then, as you say, the things that sectorally drive you into recession, as we were talking about before, the mix between shocks, Fed, and vulnerabilities are different. And as you're saying, and I think this is really what the point you're making, is that the dynamic coming out of recessions has been quite different in different cycles. So this is an interesting. We haven't seen each other in over a week, and we're back to obsessing over recessions. Let's just close this up with anything else from your trip you want to emphasize. Did you have a good meal somewhere? Did you get on the beach in Sydney? No, joking.
Well, you gave me great recommendations for Tokyo. I had a lot of fun.
Okay.
That was very good. Thank you for that.
Okay, but But just generally, is there something we haven't talked about here? I'll give you the last opportunity to make an observation.
I think I was surprised how when I would go around talking about recession risks and us being at 40% and kind of me personally being above 50 if we go into 2026, if we want to extend that probability out that far. That surprised people because I think I don't know where consensus is, but the impression I got from clients was that consensus was a bit lower than that. I kind of have been surprised at some of the consensus numbers I've heard on this. I mean, at this point, I don't feel like 40 it should be surprising by any stretch. I may even start to nudge that up after the past week here. So, and then you start talking about, well, what are markets pricing? And it doesn't seem like markets are pricing this risk at all. Even the equity market pullback is not really much at this point. Credit spreads are probably the least priced for a recession at this point. So, I just think there's risk out there that aren't being fully appreciated either in the clients that we talk to and in market pricing.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Lots on tap next week. We've gone over pretty much all of it, I think. Thanks, everybody. We'll be in the same place next week, I think, on payroll day. So we can then, come to blows or do things more physical if we want to. All right. Take care, everybody, and hope to have you on the conversation on next week's Weekender. Bye.